A reading from John, chapter 18, verses 33 through 37. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice."
The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote a parable about a king who fell in love with a humble maiden. The king was of uncommon royal lineage, a king above all kings. Every statesman feared his wrath and dared not breathe a word of displeasure. Every foreign state trembled before his power. The wealth of his holdings was unfathomable. And yet this mighty king was melted by love for a humble maiden who lived in a poor village in his vast kingdom. He longed to go to this maiden and announce his love for her, but here arose the king's dilemma. How might he declare his love? In an odd sort of way, his kingliness tied his hands. He could bring her to the palace in a carriage inlaid with gold and precious stones, and crown her head with jewels, and clothe her in the finest silk. Surely she would not resist such a proposal, for no one dared to resist the king. But would she love him? She might say she loved him, but would she be truly happy at his side? Or would she live with him in fear, or live a life of empty duty, nursing a private grief for the life she had left behind? Would she be happier to remain in obscurity, loved by an equal, content in her humble village, but confident in her love? And suppose she could not even understand him, that she could not ever forget that he was a king and that she would always be a humble maiden. Suppose she could not let shared love bridge the gulf between them, for isn't it only in love that the unequal can be made equal? He would need to win her love without overwhelming her and without destroying her free will to choose, which meant he had only one choice. He would have to descend to her, become like her, without power or riches, without the title of king. So, laying aside his crown and shedding his royal robes, he clothed himself as a beggar and approached the maiden's cottage with a worn cloak fluttering loose about him. This was not simply a disguise, this was his true form and figure now, for the king had renounced his throne, his kingdom, his castle, and had taken on a completely new identity, all for the sake of declaring his love and winning the maiden's hand. For this is the unfathomable nature of love, said Kierkegaard, that it desires equality with the beloved. In Kierkegaard's parable, this king is Jesus, of course, the immeasurable, uncontainable nature of God that so longed for shared love that it voluntarily stripped down and emptied itself of power and privilege, clothing itself in human likeness and appearing as one of us to reveal our belovedness. But this is an entirely different image of what we might expect a real king to look like, or how we might expect a real king to relate to this world, because we all know that earthly kings do not typically trade in the currency of love or so willingly relinquish their treasured power for equality. But with Jesus, we are talking about a different kind of king and a different kind of kingdom. So different, in fact, that words like king and kingdom are no longer adequate, and earthly concepts like power no longer make any sense. We see this so clearly in our gospel reading today, in which we encounter Pontius Pilate, the governor of the Roman province of Judea. He's there in the praetorium. Pilate, he's the most powerful man in Jerusalem, and standing before him is a peasant Jewish agitator from Galilee named Jesus, accused by the religious authorities of treason, a crime punishable by crucifixion. The contrast between these two figures could not be more glaring. Strength and meekness, power and weakness, hubris and humility. But it's Passover, and the last thing Pilate needs is a religious disturbance while thousands of Jews from all over the empire packed the city for the holiday observance. Pilate has enough to worry about already, so he tells the high priest to deal with their Jesus problem themselves. But they remind Pilate that he has unique duties as governor in cases like this. They say, we are not permitted to put anyone to death. In this story, it seems that everyone is looking for plausible deniability. Nobody wants to take any responsibility for executing Jesus, but in the end, the buck stops with Pilate. Yet when he summons this so-called king to the praetorium, the man standing before him is anything but kingly. A Galilean drifter, bruised and beaten, roughed up and bedraggled, with his robe torn and sullied, his hands tied behind his back. He can barely stand straight. Bare feet, swollen face, bloodied nose, eyes black and blue. And Pilate smirks. So you're a king, are you? And yet Jesus' response is astonishing. He's bruised and beaten, but he is not broken. He is not intimidated or afraid. Jesus speaks to Pilate with such confidence and poise, we might actually be convinced that he really is a king. He seems hardly a victim here. In fact, as we watch what unfolds next, it's as if Jesus turns the tables so that it's Pilate who's actually on trial. Jesus says, do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me? Look, Pilate says defensively, I'm not responsible for any of this. Your own people have handed you over to me. What have you done? But Jesus isn't interested in answering Pilate's question. Jesus is here to draw out of Pilate the one question Pilate must answer for himself, which will come soon enough. My kingdom is not of this world, says Jesus. Ah, says Pilate, so you are a king. And Jesus replies, you tell me, Pilate, I entered this world to witness to the truth. And there's something about that word, truth, that seems to strike a nerve for Pilate and lead him to finally ask that one question Jesus has come to draw out of him all along. What is truth? Asks Pilate. Anyone who has ever asked that question knows that to even dare to ask it is to acknowledge that maybe you once knew what truth was, but now you're not at all sure anymore. What is truth? Perhaps only someone who has lost their North Star, their moral compass, their tether, their mooring would ask that question. What is truth? Maybe only one who is aimlessly adrift, tossed around by the winds and waves of life, having somehow lost their anchor, would ask such a question. What is truth? Maybe it's the question of someone who, having lived long enough, has come to see how the world really works and what it takes to succeed, even just to survive sometimes. And maybe they've learned to adapt or compromise, to make certain choices out of convenience or concessions, to conform to the expectations of others, to become whatever they have to be until they no longer know who they are or what they believe or what truth really is anymore. What is truth? Asks Pilate. And he tries to wash his hands of this whole ordeal. I find no case against this man, he announces, but the crowd will not let him. Fearing an uprising, Pilate gives them a choice. He can release Jesus or Barabbas, the bandit. Surely they'll choose Jesus, right? But no. They choose Barabbas. And that's when Pilate gets the answer to his own question, what is truth? The truth is that Pilate, the most powerful man in Jerusalem, is deeply afraid. What's he so afraid of? The novelist John Steinbeck once wrote, "Power does not corrupt, fear corrupts. The fear of losing power corrupts." Pilate, the most powerful man in Jerusalem, is afraid of losing his power. And yet that's not even the hardest truth. The hardest truth comes next when Pilate says to Jesus, "You know I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you." And Jesus, still in control, tells Pilate the hard truth that no earthly ruler ever wants to hear. "You would have no power over me," he says, "unless it had been given you from above." What is truth? The truth is that Pilate is not the most powerful man in Jerusalem after all. The most powerful man in Jerusalem is standing right before him, this roughed up, beaten, and bloodied rabbi from Galilee, who chose love over power, and who came to show Pilate that the kingdoms of this world and those who rule them have no power over God. Jesus exposes the truth and shows Pilate the truth, that the powers of this world will always capitulate to the demands of the crowd in order to hold on to power. That the powers of this world will always choose expediency over conscience and moral compromise over moral courage. This has always been the nature of imperial power, and it is still true today. But that day in the Praetorium, the symbol of the world's power, that is, Jesus demonstrates an entirely different kind of power. And I believe it's one of the greatest powers in the world. It's the power to stand next to someone and bravely hold their fear in your hand and show it to them. Show it to them not in judgment or condemnation, but in all its truth. And Pilate wants to know the truth, and Jesus shows it to him. And the truth is that despite all the power you may have thought you possessed, Pilate, in the end, there is an even higher power, only it doesn't look like power, it looks like love. Jesus' power comes from a whole different place. It doesn't come from an earthly kingdom. It's a power that in one moment can hold up the consequences of one's decisions and imperfections, like Pilate's, like our own. Hold it up to the scrutiny and grace of God, but it's also the kind of power that in the next moment can hold our deepest fears and longings and say to us, "Be not afraid." And that's the power the world needs so much more of. For about 300 years after Christ, Christians wielded this kind of power throughout the Roman Empire. It was extraordinary. It was beautiful. The early Christians were living in a deeply pagan world. The Greek philosophers at that time were teaching that love and mercy and compassion were actually character defects. The Greeks believed that mercy contradicted justice because it provided unearned relief. Mercy was not governed by reason, they said, and therefore the impulse to show mercy and compassion to the poor, to the sick, that must be curbed. But then the early Christians showed up and they took seriously this idea that a merciful God requires us to be merciful. Because God loves us, we must love one another. And they knew that to practice mercy and compassion, they would have to refuse to go along with the prevailing view of culture, to refuse to take the easy path. They would have to reject the impulse to seek respect or gain social or political power. Like Jesus, they too belonged to a different kingdom, one not of this world. They didn't need Caesar's power or Caesar's blessing to live faithfully in the world. They had all the power they needed, an ample supply of compassion and mercy. All they needed now was to form an alternative community to channel that power. And so they formed what they called the ecclesia, the church. And what took place over the next 300 years, despite living under a cloud of intolerance and persecution, was this beautiful exuberance of caring and sharing on the part of Christians that was unique in all of antiquity. The church became such a powerful force of compassion throughout the whole empire that one historian, Tertullian, said that those Christians drove the Romans and pagans absolutely crazy. In fact, one of the fiercest enemies of Christianity, Julian the Apostate was his name, he publicly lamented that because those Christians of his day were doing a better job of caring for the Romans than the Romans were, more and more people were converting to Christianity. By the middle of the 3rd century, historians tell us that the church was caring for some 1,500 citizens in Rome alone. The hungry, the old, the orphaned infants and children. And so Julian the Apostate proposed that the best way to stop the rapid growth of Christianity was to actually adopt the Christian methods of caring for people, to normalize compassion in society. Which reminds me of something theologian Stanley Hauerwas once said. The church doesn't have a social strategy, he said. The church is a social strategy. Hauerwas is absolutely right. The way to change the world is to live as a changed people, to prove that it can be done. And the early church proved that it didn't need the levers of government. It didn't need political power or Caesar's blessing. It didn't need victories at the ballot box. All it needed was a fierce commitment to being an alternative community in the world, believing that the world would find that community so compelling and so beautiful that it would want to become like it. Tertullian, the historian, gives us this beautiful account of that alternative community called the church and their deep commitment of these Christians to compassion. He wrote this: "Though we have our treasure chest, it is not made up of purchase money as of a religion that has its price. On the monthly day, if he likes, each puts in a small donation, but only if it be his pleasure, and only if he is able. For there is no compulsion, all is voluntary. These gifts are, as it were, piety's deposit fund, for they are not taken and spent on feasts and drinking bouts and eating houses, but to support and bury poor people, to supply the wants of boys and girls of destitute means and parents, and of old persons confined now to the house, such too as have suffered shipwreck. And if there happen to be any in the mines or banished to the islands or shut up in prisons, for nothing but their fidelity to the cause of God's church, They become the nurslings of their confession. The early church didn't have a social strategy. It was a social strategy. And the early Christians gave themselves sacrificially to it. Consider this. Maybe the most subversive of all social and political acts that we as followers of this unlikely king named Jesus can engage in isn't joining protests or engaging in boycotts or writing letters to politicians, as important and vital and necessary as all of these can be. Maybe the most subversive act against the powers of this age is to be a part of the alternative community called the church, to show up for it, to step into it, to support it, to pray along with it the words of the revolution, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, to join with it in singing a hymn into the world's loneliness and desperation, to serve the poor and the hungry and the naked and the lonely through its ministries, to sit in a pew and ask for forgiveness, to come to a table and eat bread and wine, to turn to a stranger and say, peace be with you. There are no more subversive acts in the world than these. And there is no other community in the world in which we can do them. Our takeaways for today: the unfathomable nature of God's love is that it desires equality with the beloved. The church doesn't have a social strategy. The church is a social strategy. And the way to change the world is to live as changed people.